All right, here we go. Uh, First of all, I want to say it's been a fun opportunity over the last couple of weeks to take a deeper dive into um, the many hyperlinks on your site to all the different work that you've done over the last, I don't know, what is it now? 45 years of work on that site?
Pretty much, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Um, and obviously I want to thank you for taking the time to chat about it. I think hopefully this will be a
Well,
fun way for us to connect.
what I want to know is, have you recovered from taking all that in?
That is an unanswerable question as of right now. I may never recover, but I'm not sure it's something you want to necessarily recover from. Um, I did at moments have a feeling of like, perhaps it's wiser to space this stuff out and see, allow it to kind of percolate in between, um, taking something in. But whatever, that I did it the way I did it. So we'll see what comes of it. Um, yeah, as I was coming to the end of I thank you for putting off the interview for another week because I wanted to kind of continue to see what I could get through. And I didn't end up getting through. I got through almost everything, with the exception of maybe one or two films, and maybe and I was kind of going like chunk by chunk. I did the films, and then the video poems, and then the experimentals, and sort of like that. And I didn't get to the all of the paratheatrical uh, documents, unfortunately. But we could talk a little bit about those, and then maybe talk more about them at some other time. Uh, but one of the things that occurred to me as I was coming to the end of that time was you've done such an incredibly good job of. I had this discouraging feeling of like, oh, this might be a superfluous conversation. You've done such a good job of documenting what you're doing and why and what the sequence has been, that really anyone can go find it and dig for themselves. So I hope this whole thing doesn't end up just being redundant, but
Go for it.
yeah. um I had a couple of thoughts to kind of get us started, which is obviously all of your work has a deeply spiritual element to it, and weaves throughout everything you've done, whether it be the paratheater or the artistic work, or even some of your teaching astrological stuff and eight trigger brain. So what was it? I mean, was there a time in this lifetime that you were like, that sort of got started for you, your interest in uh, uh, the spiritual dimensions of life and spiritual explorations, as it were?
um, yeah, that's an interesting question. So, um, I had a pretty great childhood. I won't kind of go into it too much, but see, I wasn't raised by a father. I didn't have a father. I was raised by two women, a mother and a grandmother, and they were working women, so they weren't really around 24/7.
Right.
Uh, and me and my little brother, he's 2 years younger than me, we basically had the time of our lives, outdoors a lot more than indoors, playing with other kids, creating games, having adventures. Some of these adventures we would keep to ourselves because if we shared them with the parents, they would reprimand us or limit us from our adventures. So we started basically living a double life. um, Adventures like hopping freight trains, or exploring the underground sewer systems of Los Angeles from the LA River out to Griffith Park. There's a whole complex of tunnels that branch out between those two locations.
Hmm.
And these kinds of events, I was just like, 13, 14 years old. He was, 11 or 12. Really informed a certain spirit of adventure that just hasn't ended. That there's just kind of kept going on, especially, the exploration of the underground sewer systems, wandering in complete blackness. We didn't have, we forbid flashlights. We thought, that would just
Oh my God.
be not nearly as fun. So it was just kind of like moving. I mean, it took us like a couple hours of walking and pitch black. We didn't know what it was. I mean, if we had put the light on, we probably would have turned and ran screaming, because
Oh
who
my
knows
God.
down there? There's rats and there's shit and there's garbage. Who knows,
Oh
right?
my
We didn't
God.
know. So we had nothing to be afraid of. There was no fear of, we got over the fear of the unknown because we didn't see anything, yet we were entering the unknown. If we had saw something, we would have been scared.
Hmm.
So fear of unknown went out the window. We just wandered into the unknown until we found the little uh, kind of a light coming from the distance that got bigger and bigger and bigger. Oh, here's another exit. Let's see what's happening. Oh my God, it's this huge nature area. We didn't know what Griffith Park was at that time. We just thought we had entered paradise from some kind of weird abyss. Um, so anyway, I think it started from there. And then, in my teens, I grew up in LA during the late 60s, right? So there's this huge social revolution that was occurring, and rampant easy access to psychedelics, pot, and a whole cultural revolution that was happening there. So I was experimenting with LSD from the age of 15 to probably about 23. And my experimentation there was it was more inspired as a kind of a research process. I never was really into taking these huge heroic doses and getting all kind of fucked up in the psychedelic dimension. It was more like using half doses or sometimes whole doses simply to watch the behavior of my nervous system and starting to discover, okay, I'm inhabiting a nervous system during this trip. I'm inhabiting a different kind of body than my physical body. And I'm starting to experience myself as a self-aware brain, self-aware nervous system, reflecting on itself. So that, I think, was like at the beginning point of a kind of spiritual self-awareness at that point. And then around the age of 23, and I had already begun, I had already been involved in about 6 years of active performance. I started out with training, performance, and teaching mime theater. And at 23, I had come home. I was living in Berkeley, in the Berkeley Hills, and I had come home from a really intense rehearsal of my first mime play. It's like a full-length mime play, an ensemble play, and just dead exhausted. And I just threw myself on the bed, with my girlfriend at the time, and I just basically passed out. But what happened when I closed my eyes was a series of internal changes that erupted into a full-blown out-of-body experience. I wasn't on drugs, wasn't on any other thing besides the vapors of emotional and psychic exhaustion from the intense rehearsal. And it was a life-changing experience, because coming out of that, it was impossible for me to, from that point on to this very day, settle on my physical body as who I am, that I had in the out-of-body experience been able to inhabit a kind of a double or a kind of an astral entity version of myself, self-aware, very aware of my environment. I didn't leave the room. I just kind of basically hung out in the bedroom, mostly to help me verify when I woke up that this was not just a dream, but this was something different.
Yeah.
And since then, I mean, 23, I'm 70 now. That's like almost 50 years. I've gone through a series of experimental theater productions and 30 years of filmmaking that have a consistent thread of a kind of oneric vision. And oneric means processes that are tied to nocturnal dreams and informed by dreams and out of body states. So, characters oftentimes in my movies, their fates, where they end up, are often informed, sometimes traumatically, sometimes in an inspiring way, by their nocturnal dreams. So my the thread that's gone through all my art has been this kind of interaction between the dream time and the daytime, between the imaginal dimension and the actual world, and the crossover and how they impact each other. And this has been kind of my way of, in a sense, coping with and really an ongoing transformation of that trauma, which is how I experienced the out of body experience. I mean, it was kind of great, but at the same time, I came back to my body shaking like a leaf,
Mhm.
completely petrified. What the fuck happened there?
Yeah. Yeah.
Who am I? And I was just completely um, terrified. However, the next day, I tried to do it again. I wanted to go back again for some reason, some crazy reason. I didn't want to go back right after I did it. I wanted to just go to church or something. I didn't
Right. Yeah.
he wanted to get away from that out of body place. But yeah, I tried to get away. I wanted to get back into it. And I tried. And my double or astral body or whatever was in resistance. It wasn't ready to go. And so I just said, oh, say, screw it. We'll just wait, see what happens. And I think what happened there was that it transformed into about a 2-year period where, for some reason, I gained some unconscious talent, because I didn't know I had it, of lucid dreaming.
Mm.
Right. So I was in the dream time and was able to change the setting of the dream, the activity of the dream, simply by thinking. So the thought process has dictated the image, the dimension, the action of the dream, and also the people that I would meet. I would kind of start managing the dream through my thought processes, and then waking up in the next morning in the mundane world, kind of depressed because I lost the total freedom. There's no control here,
Right.
not the kind of control I had in my dream. So I had to stop it. I said, no more. This is not going anywhere. So
Mm.
I kind of gave up pursuing the lucid dream thing.
Mm.
So I mean, I can go on and on about that, but basically, it's come along through those episodes and this ongoing process of self reinvention through every film I make. It really becomes its own vehicle for advancing not just the craft of my films, because I like to, what's the word? Give myself a very different challenge with each film, whether it's technically or with the theme. I don't like repeating anything. As always, have a different way of exploring this interplay between the imaginal and the actual. And
Well,
so,
I those are three very key. What I heard was three very key formative experiences. These sort of the adventures through the sewer systems and the explorations. And it's funny because I actually, in your films, there's lots of like, it feels like you've continued to do that. There's lots of tunnels and lots of underground ruins of various kinds that you seem to find and shoot in. But then, of course, growing up at the time you grew up, what was happening in the country and the availability and the exposure to psychedelics, and then of course this out of body and lucid dreaming experience. Those all sound very, strong, clear, formative um, experiences for you, and it makes sense looking at the later work, how those shaped you and how they continued to shape your work. I definitely, one strong theme I see through all of your work is that, I guess, what the Buddhists might call the subtle realm, or um, dream time, or dream space, or the like you're calling it also the imaginal, or there's a lot of different ways of talking about it or naming it. I like that you're kind of weaving in the Artaud stuff too. I think what he called the double is sort of something like the energy body or the subtle body of what how the Buddhists might call subtle body. Um, the other little curiosity I had about, like, I don't know, origin stories, as it were. You obviously, coming up at the time you were growing up, exploring the things you were exploring, you got that counterculture was, if you were experimenting with drugs, and in the counterculture, of course, there was all kinds of spiritual stuff floating around in the country and in the zeitgeist at that time, and often there was an overlap between that counterculture and the creativity and art. Obviously, anytime you get into um, psychedelics, or and creativity, that stuff goes hand in hand. But specifically, I feel like poetry is a big part of it. Just seems like a pretty important thing for you, especially as you get into the video poems. But I think your whole style, you sort of, I think I've heard you describe your style and the artists you're attracted to as the more poetic um, films. Sometimes you call them visionary films. So I'm just curious, like, for you, as you got into the video poems, Rimbaud, Sylvia Plath, William Blake, uh, Rilke. Was there a time when? Yeah, I'm just wondering if you can speak a little bit to, like, when poetry came into your life, if you have any clear sense of that, or when you started reading it a lot, or possibly
Yeah,
even writing.
yeah, very clear. I was living in Seattle, Washington between 1988 and 1996. And during that time, I became the editor and publisher of an alternative literary paper called the Talking Raven Quarterly.
Hmm.
And it was revolving around poetry, but also art, and a very strong poetic sensibility. And it was a local paper that we published every quarterly, every equinox and solstice, 4 times a year, anywhere from 5 to 10,000 copies that we would distribute free on the streets. It didn't cost anything. So there's all this poetry being moving out every quarter all across Seattle from our team. There's a teamwork. We had about a half a dozen of us putting it out, and I was kind of responsible for figuring out how to generate the funding to pay for it all. And miraculously, the paper was floated, meaning we were able to pay the printer when a particular venue in downtown Seattle called the Weathered Wall opened up their venue and say, hey, use this to raise money for your paper. They believed in us. Just pay the doorman, like $50 or whatever, and then the rest of it's yours. And so we staged a series of benefit performances featuring poets, performers, musicians, actors, all kinds of individuals that would volunteer to create these kind of amazing nights. It's kind of a showcase of talent nights for over 4 years, and it managed to, to pay the printer. But anyway, that's all kind of like the external stuff. The poetic influence came to me out of necessity. And what happened around 1990, this is the year before I started Talking Raven, is that I suffered a kind of a mini stroke that threw me. I was walking along the streets and just immediately just threw me down to the pavement, where I lost complete muscle control over the right part of my body. And I call it a mini stroke because I was actually able to get up and walk away. And yet it had some fairly devastating symptoms afterwards that were completely new to me. I mean, my whole brain felt scrambled. My whole thinking and speaking process felt confused and fragmented, and I realized that what was happening was a breakdown in my linguistic and intellectual brain, that I was not able to interpret and translate my sensory input in the way I had before. So I had two reactions to this. One of them was, oh shit, I'm going to die.
Yeah.
And I can't live like this. And the other one was, yay, I've been wanting to really start breaking down some of these old obsolete ways of thinking and these stale assumptions I've had about writing, because I've been plagued by bad writing for a while, and I really need a change. And yet I knew I couldn't do it by myself, by my own efforts alone. I realized that I wasn't going to get through this. I tried, I put effort into it. It was just like, nah, that's not working. So I realized that I needed to align with a poet, almost as an apprenticeship, but not necessarily a living poet. I needed to immerse myself in a particular poet in a very profound way, as in a whole year-long study and immersion in the works of a poet that I wanted to somehow aspire towards their way of interpreting, their way of finding the poetics in any given situation. And I was at the time having coffee with a friend of mine who later became my wife of almost 30 years now. But this is before we were, a couple. And she says, well, what about Rilke? And I said, well, I don't know. What about Rilke? Because I hadn't read Rilke before. And so she says, well, here's the book. Because she had the book. She was reading Rilke at the time. And I took it and I brought it home. And it immediately found resonance in my attention. I just could not stop paying attention to not just the words he was using, but the underlying tone of silence. This was a quiet poet. This was not a screaming poet. This was a poet that spoke and wrote and thought from silence first, and then from that discovered the expressions from silence into form. And I'm very aware of that process of through the paratheta work of starting in a formless, receptive place and then discovering the form that comes out of that more organically. So that really spoke to me in his poems. And then I discovered in this book the epic lament, Requiem for a Friend, Stephen Mitchell translation. And reading through that just completely opened the door to me. And I said, this is the piece I'm gonna be married to this piece. This is my future.
Mm.
And so that turned into a performance piece, a very unlikely performance piece. How do you perform Rilke's Requiem for a Friend? And yet a vision came to me, a very strong vision of, yeah, we can do this. I figured this how I can do this. And we did. We set up 3 weekends in an art gallery in downtown Seattle called the Bell Gallery. And we performed it, and it was extremely well attended, extremely well received, and which was really unexpected and surprising. I didn't know what to expect. And so that was in 1991. And then fast forward to 2005, and I decided to write a screenplay for a feature-length film
Mm.
that included the entirety of Requiem for a Friend. A Requiem for a Friend is a very long piece of prose. If you just sit down and read it out loud, it's going to take about a half hour, with the right pacing. So the whole entirety of the prose work is within the screenplay. The screenplay was written, the characters, the situations, the drama, the conflict was all inspired by the images and the theme of Requiem for a Friend, which was basically Rilke spending 3 nights in the Hotel Biron in Paris, France. This is where the sculptor Auguste Rodin lived and worked. They were friends. In fact, Rilke was the secretary of Rodin for quite a while. So anyway, he was there supposedly just for 1 night, but he stayed 3 nights because apparently, in his experience, the ghost of his good friend, the artist Paula Modersohn Becker, had entered the building and was talking to him in the room. Paula had died suddenly a year before from complications from the birth of her first child.
Mm.
And she was a very seriously committed artist. And she had some very serious interactions with Rilke about how some women who are artistically committed aren't necessarily um, here to bear children. That there was an argument between them. That Rilke was concerned because she wanted to have a child, and he was concerned that it would go wrong. He had a certain sensitivity, as many poets do, to the power of creation and the power of creation taking a poetic form and then a more literal form through offspring and biology. So it's like a crossroads, do I commit myself to my art or to motherhood or fatherhood, whatever it is? It's like there's a lot of individuals that are at that crossroad. Can I do both?
Mm-hmm.
And so I've had personal experience with, because, there's one woman that mothered 2 of my children. She was a committed artist. And she still is, sort of, but she also struggled immensely with the first child, who actually ended up dying
Mm-hmm.
at the age of 2. And so she, in a sense, shared in that tragedy. And ironically, or not, I don't know, that woman who was the mother of my second child who died was also in the performance of Requiem for a Friend.
Oh, wow.
With that child in her belly. She performed 8 months pregnant. Yeah. And she was a dancer, so professional dancer out of Juilliard in New York City. So she had this extraordinary dance performance as a pregnant to become mother in the performance of our child, who would just under 2 years, suddenly pass away. So anyway, going back to Requiem for a Friend, in 2005, we performed it in Berkeley, California, as a separate performance. We kind of replicated what we did in Seattle, but we brought it to another level with it. And then we took the video footage from that and planted it into the larger story of the screenplay of the movie called The Greater Circulation. Mm-hmm. And so, that particular poetic influence has been with me for a long time, and it redeemed me. It kind of helped me rebuild my relationship with thinking, writing, speaking from a more organic place. Through that time, through that process. So I was able to, in a sense, rebuild my kind of intellectual circuitry, up until this point, God be willing. I mean, I know stories of individuals who suffer mini strokes, they're more vulnerable to like a larger stroke at any time. It's just one of those things, you can't predict that. But so far, so good.
Yeah. Sometimes there are strange physical occurrences or even illnesses that are sort of more like spiritual interventions than they are. That's sometimes the only way to describe them or explain, because anyway.
Well, that's an interesting point, because I think it partly true, but I think more so is how the individual responds to the spiritual emergency. Mm-hmm. Trauma is really tricky in that way, because if you have a strong artistic inclination, I think it's more natural to want to transform your pain into something more beautiful, if only to learn how to live better with it, to live with more beauty. If you don't have that inclination so strong, it's more often the case, and I've seen this a lot because I've worked with a lot of groups in different capacities, not just artistic, but consultation-wise. They make a trauma out of the trauma, meaning they have the traumatic event, but then they can't stop traumatizing the event. Mm-hmm. They can't stop overreacting. They just like a regurgitation of trauma upon trauma. So it's this like layer of self-created trauma over the initial trauma, which may have not have been self-created at all. Mm. It just may have been something that happened to them either by accident or some, weird twist of fate that they were victimized by, and then they just simply couldn't stop reacting to it.
Yeah, I think certainly it could be like sort of there's always the danger of sort of magical thinking, and I think I definitely understand your point of it's more about what you do with it more than exactly why it happened. Sometimes the why it happened is irrelevant. But I guess I was meaning in the sense of, synchronicities, these sort of meaningful coincidences where you go back and you go, I don't, it's not like, for example, I don't have any particular history of that and haven't had any continuation of that, but it did happen at a time and in a place that was ended up being exceptionally meaningful and created an opening for me, in my life. Sometimes illnesses or traumas, I feel like, can have that kind of synchronistic quality. Yeah, not always, but I think, so going back, it sounds like you had been writing before you got into Rilke. You had been writing, maybe not poetry exactly, but you had been writing film and creating theater. And so you'd sort of been writing, and you ended up creating this literary magazine, this poetry magazine. But maybe that time with Rilke was the beginning of all the other poets that you ended up exploring, and your most concrete connection to reading or studying or getting intimate with those poets. Is that right?
Yeah, very much so. And that's where it started for me. Before Talking Raven, the writing I did was primarily more metaphysically
Mm-hmm.
defined, into the system called the eighth circuit brain. Also doing some writing on the paratheta work I had developed starting in 1977, and astrology, some of that.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't make any films before my first feature was 1993, which was in response to the trauma of,
Mm-hmm.
the death of my daughter.
Right.
Um,
Yeah.
and that particular trauma launched me on a 30-year era of making films almost pretty much every other year. Right now, this is 2023, 1993. That's exactly 30 years, 15 feature art films, features, 15 of them.
It's
I don't know where that
prolific.
energy came from. I mean, that's a lot of output, because it's not
Yeah.
just me. These are teamwork processes, fundraising processes. I mean, it's crazy just looking back and thinking, like, how did that happen?
It
And
really is.
you know,
Go ahead.
no, I'm going to say, and here I am. I'm actually, in the ideation pre-production phases for my next feature. It's nuts.
I love to hear that. That makes me thrilled to hear that. It is pretty extraordinary. You know, prolific to do that many films. There's very few people that, and I tell a lot of my friends, I circle around the entertainment industry to some degree, and uh, when I tell anybody that, I have this friend that has done 16 features kind of on his own terms, that in and of itself is extraordinarily impressive. And I think there's a lot of reasons why you were able to pull that off. And partially it's how you went about doing it, but in some ways, how you went about doing it maybe added to the difficulty. But this actually brings me around to another thought I had that came up for me in going through your stuff, which is, I know that Towards a Poor Theater, Jerzy Grotowski's book, was influential for you, and that in a lot of ways, from a very early on, you sort of were committed to the art life, and not that you took a vow of poverty, but you were willing to do whatever it took to figure out a way to make ends meet, but certainly didn't feel a need for a financially lavish life, and that what was more important to you was continuing to make work that seemed interesting and meaningful, and you were perfectly happy to live, let's say, on the lower end of the income spectrum, from a larger picture. And I know you found ways to make plenty of money, and I don't know the details of your financial life, but part of that, I started to watch as I was watching your film, and revisiting the Poor Theater, Grotowski's Poor Theater. I was sort of like, it's almost. I know you have a a vision statement as to why you do films and the way you do them, and a cinema of, I think it's otherness or something like that. That the way you articulate that, and there's a lot to be talked about there. But I kind of wondered if some of what you've been doing is sort of a towards a towards a poor cinema in a lot of ways, where you're like, because it's not a commitment that a lot of people have, or an awareness that, like, you can make film after film after film like you've done on very little money. Everybody's out there trying to get grants, trying to get funding, trying to, do their. So I'm just wondering, is there anything to that? Is that just something I'm seeing that's
Well,
not there?
so I'm going to go back a little bit to a certain revelation that I had um, back in high school. Informs this is actually the day after my first LSD trip. Something like a light bulb went off in me, and um, that was going to school the next day, having this awareness that there was nothing really being taught in the high school that I was in that was going to help me survive in the real world after I escape high school, except two courses: typing No computers back then. You learn how to
Right.
type
Yeah.
on a typewriter, right? And drama.
Huh.
And so I put all of my attention, and I didn't know, I didn't have any kind of evidence. It was just like a hunch that these are the two really important things. I got to figure this out. This is going to help me break out into the real world when I finally get that chance. And so up until that time, I was almost like an A student. I was like getting mostly A's, B's, and everything. And I said, okay, I'm just going to drop everything down to D's, C's, and D's, except for drama and typing. And I graduated and I got out of there. Um, by the time I was 17, I graduated when I was 17. I knew exactly what I wanted to do for the rest of my life. It was so clear. And that was, I am here. My purpose on earth is to create experimental theater. I didn't know exactly how I was going to do it, but I knew this was the way I was going to give expression to what I experienced in my psyche. And
Hmm.
that was it. And so that was the big dream. Um, Now, to do that, I also knew that I needed time. And I had to come to terms with how I was going to survive and create theater, meaning write, direct, audition actors, rehearse, perform, promote, all that stuff. How's I going to do that? And it was a serious realization that the time of my life was more important than money,
Hmm.
that I
Hmm.
needed time more than I needed money. And I came to realize that there was two kinds of time. There was the 9 to 5, tick, 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 second, minute, hour time, symbolic time, punch clock time that most people enter. They enter into the workforce and they're on a 5-day, 9 to 5, 40-hour kind of, and their life is taken up by their work,
Hmm.
by a schedule of symbolic time, not real time, symbolic time, measured by schedule and numbers. Real time, the time of my life, is connected to almost like an infinite track of having all the time in the world. How am I going to have the experience of having all the time in the world? Make an art out of poverty.
Hmm.
Become very clear about what my basic needs were and just stay close to the most fundamental needs I had for food, shelter, um, and whatever clothing I needed. So all that kind of material dimension uh, became completely secondary to uh, restoring the time of my life, because I didn't have it before school. I didn't have the time of my life. You go to school, it's
Right. Yeah.
kind of like work, it's a schedule, fucking classes. Um, so yeah, all throughout my 20s, I made an art out of poverty. Food stamps were part of it. A little welfare with, Medi-Cal, whatever it was, to go to
Hmm.
the dentist or, get some tetracycline for flu or whatever it was, So I was getting by on that. And basically teaching children piano lessons of a particular style I had. I couldn't read music, so I couldn't teach them how to read music. And they kind of got into that because I taught them how to play piano, kind of improvisational style. And so they were kind of getting into that. And they would go home to their parents and show them their little something. The parents would say, "Oh, my child came home and he was already playing something. It's wonderful.
Yeah.
Well, who do I write the check to for the next 3 months?" That
Yeah.
kind of thing.
That's funny.
And, I was clowning at children's birthday parties. And this was now in the early 70s. I was in the business of selling cannabis. It was illegal, of course, but, so I had about three little, survival gigs that allowed me to pay my rent and feed myself and get by. until I was into my 30s. And then, when I had my first child at 33, I said, oh, I got to get serious about making more money. This is one more mouth to feed.
Yeah.
And so that's when my plan was to continue living as, an art out of poverty for about a year, to write a book. I gave myself a year to finish my first book, because I had this belief that this book would somehow get published and I would get paid for it, and this would become part of my future financial support. I was a total unknown. I had no reason, to believe that. I just was like going on faith alone, just fueled by faith, totally. Finished the book. I called it Angel Tech. It was my take on Timothy Leary's 8-circuit brain system. But it was advancing his theories into practice through basically theater games at that point, theater exercises, rituals, certain meditations, all of them geared towards providing the reader the opportunity to begin experiencing these 8 circuits of the intelligence of the brain firsthand, as somatic, sensory, as well as perceptual and emotional, physical experiences. So they're not just theoretical constructs. And one thing led to another. I won't go into the details, it's kind of complicated, but it got picked up by a middle level press, not small press, not giant. It's not like a Simon and Schuster press, but somewhere in the middle. I said Simon and Schuster, didn't I?
Yeah, I got you.
um, so and it did really well, and I started getting seeing more money than I've ever seen in my life, and it inspired me to continue writing more books, and they continued publishing them, and then I walked away from that, and decided that I would self-publish my future books, because there would be no middleman. I would simply make more money. And then eventually, using those books as a basis of teaching classes, in the subject matter.
Mhm.
So I'm thinking I'm starting to lose the thread of your question.
Oh,
So,
we're on the right track. It's connected to the basically the budgets, the reason you've been able to do 16
right.
films. And I know there's a lot of, I think, aesthetic and philosophical standpoint you have around the how and why you do your work. And I was wondering if this it seems to me that part of how and why you're able to continue making your films is because you've always been doing things on a shoestring budget. You've always been willing, it was more important to you just to make the work and make it with a certain integrity rather than worry about whether it makes much money or worry about how much it costs to make. You just always been like, I'm just going to make it, it seems. Anyway, there's even something in your website somewhere talking about you avoided looking for grants and maybe even quit. There's some reasons why maybe you quit applying to, submitting to film festivals and really uh, have chosen not to go the route that a lot of people go as they start to get to wanting to make
Yeah,
films.
yeah,
And I've got to find ways to fundraise. I've got to find people to
right.
give me money, and so
Thanks for reeling me back to reality here.
yeah, it's a
No, to answer you there, it comes from my values. It starts with my basic values, which are not material, and because of that, I have no mainstream ambitions.
yeah.
I have no Hollywood industry ambitions. I have no interest in, the standards and values that are set forth by the Hollywood film industry, for their blockbusters or their studio productions or anything like that, or even the so-called indie or independent dimensions of film are often not truly independent, but they're also somehow tagged into studio money in some way or another. So I'm not even an indie filmmaker. I'm what's called underground.
Mm.
And I like it down here. I like the view. I like the view from the underground.
Down in the sewers,
Yeah, so
exploring the sewers.
I'm what you call a make do artist.
Yeah.
And I've gotten really good at making do with what I have. And because I have no mainstream ambitions, and what I was just saying,
Mm.
I've only made the movies that I want to make, and it's been with zero consideration for target markets or demographics, or I have not created anything for an audience. I've only made the movies that I want to make.
Mm.
And that typically is based on wanting to see the kind of movie I haven't seen before. I revel in a spirit of discovery, of being exposed to new ways of seeing, uh, and also developing new contexts to reframe what I'm seeing and feeling and experiencing. So that is a big part of how I move forward. Is doing what I can not to repeat what I've already seen done. And this is part of the challenge every time. I don't do good with reruns. I don't do good with repetition. It leaves a kind of a bad taste in my mouth, even when I start trying to replicate a previous success or a film that I really like. Well, I would like to do sort of something like that again. And I start getting into the first few pages of the screenplay, and I feel like I'm going to throw up in my mouth. Because it's, so no, don't repeat. Let's, set the bar higher, or at least set it somewhere far away.
Mm.
So, you can learn something new and, stretch your craft, stretch your talent constantly over and over again.
I think, there's thinking about that in one of our exchanges leading up to this. I asked if Tragos and Drive Time were, I hadn't watched them yet, and I was asking if they were somehow uh, sequels, like, or that they were somehow connected. And I think there are certain themes. You said you don't do sequels, which I got loud and clear, and it makes sense that there is one of the things that people. I was having conversations with friends this week. One of the many things people bemoan about the current nature of content that's being generated and produced is, and I think maybe this is always true to some degree, is cliche, repetition, reboots, franchises, that kind of thing. So I get that that's not, from an artistic point of view, of course, it's kind of death, and that you have you're very sensitive to that, which I think is fabulous and inspiring. Um, that said, there are a number of themes that come back. Like the reason I thought maybe Tragos and Drive Time are connected is because I think you use the term Drive Time in Tragos, and it's not the same universe. But sometimes there are certain themes or qualities that definitely come back in your work over and over and over again. The underground tunnels, for example that we were talking about, or dream sequences, which you talked about, the imaginal and the actual. So there's certainly, you're not doing sequels, you're not repeating exactly, but there's certainly thematic qualities that tend to show up in your work over and over again, and sometimes even idea like words like drive time that show up
It's
multiple
true.
times.
I think the main change in each film is the context of these themes.
Mm-hmm.
Changes quite a bit, and also let's say the style, because my films are very difficult to pigeonhole because I don't make them for the market, so I'm not thinking genre. You have to think genre if you're going to sell your work.
Yeah.
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 So I don't do genre. In fact, each of my films is it's its own. I'm creating a bunch of little genres, and so I have my own way of describing. Like the drive time is a cyber-fi experiment, or Tragos is a cyber noir witch hunt.
Hmm.
So these kinds of phrases, kind of labels, like, okay, I'm going to create my own genre. This is what I'm going to call it, and maybe that'll help people understand. Oh, I think I'd like to look at that, but it's none of them. I mean, even sometimes I work with influences of kind of a noir, kind of a detective or criminal noir quality, but I deviate quite a bit from the origins of that genre, out of the 30s and 40s, the black and white crime movies that were so great that came out of that, the more what they call noir um, film style.
Just to back up to some of the films, in being more specific, I got to watch Oracle, which was your first film, right?
Yep.
And that's the one that was motivated by the personal tragedy, the loss of your second daughter, and was made in large part with your partner at the time,
Yes.
mother of your child.
Yeah.
Um, you've described to me in the past that that shortly after that you sort of picked up a camera, and that was the beginning of you working with video, uh, or moving images as a medium. That tragedy. Did it go right into the first film, or were there other like video projects prior to that? Did it, like, you started just messing around and then it started to form, after a couple of mess arounds, you were like, you know what, maybe this is a film? And
Yeah. My daughter passed away in September of 1992. And the Oracle was made in the summer of 1993.
Mhm.
Um, I was messing around quite a bit with pretty much just learning the camera, pointing it at almost anything that struck my fancy. And then I got a really primitive kind of a audio video edit machine, so I
Mhm.
can call it. And I could see that I could sequence these little moments that I would be shooting randomly around into these little, like 5-minute little pieces. Um,
Mm.
and then they started, because I was already at that time, that this was in the Talking Raven time from 91 to 95, experimenting with poetry. And I decided to work with poems as a kind of narrative to these little quirky, idiosyncratic 5-minute videos. And now, oh, this is a video poem now. So it's like a new genre, I guess. And so I created about maybe half a dozen of those. And that is what gave me confidence to, move into a possible feature.
Mm.
Um, so there was definitely a lot of experimentation right afterwards. I mean, I was still obviously in shock and traumatized. You don't get over the loss of a child ever.
Mm.
In some ways,
No.
you just learn to live with it, and find a way to um what's the word, commemorate your memories of the child, that are always with you in a sense. um and all of that fueled the inspiration for these video poems. um, and then also the actual film, the feature of the Oracle.
Mhm.
um, the creation of it was in a way part of an out of body experience for me, in a way, because how can I put this? It's kind of a wild way of talking about it, but the scripting of that film was informed by the presence of my dead child.
Mm.
There was a thread of guidance that I was following through some kind of inter dimensional link with her, um, all throughout the process of scripting it and also making the film itself.
Hmm.
Where she wanted to be in the movie. She decided she created a character for herself as the granddaughter of this old
Hmm.
cynical patriarch who, the story is revolving around. It says final day on Earth, only nobody knows it's his final day on Earth because he's in bed sleeping, interrupted by these eruptions of he's talking in his sleep basically, but the words are coming out as pure poetry. And the old guy was never a poet. He was almost like more of the rationalist type.
Hmm.
And his family is around the bedside, the nurse, the sister, the granddaughter, and they're just kind of baffled as to what's going on. He's talking in his sleep, and it sounds like poetry. And indeed, it was poetry. I got permission from one of the main translators of Pablo Neruda's work, William O'Daly, to utilize Neruda's Book of Questions.
It's very
So,
cool.
so here he was in bed, and the poetry, everything came out as questions,
Hmm.
questions after questions, and then he would, fall back into, unconsciousness, and in that unconsciousness, his granddaughter would appear as a guide through a series of bardo dimensions. As he was guided to his into the great beyond.
Hmm.
um but yeah, that was a spooky process.
Yeah, yeah. It's powerful. I could, because I know you and I know a little bit about its origin, and a little bit about its development or process. It was really cool to get to finally see that first film that came from that. And it's a simple but powerful piece full of creativity, and it's really extraordinary. Um, the final image, yeah, it's like part of me wants to ask you questions about it, but I don't need. At another level, it's like it's a really I get I, it communicates something, or I get something from that final moment. Um, yeah, it does. It does. The other one though, another one that really stuck out in my watching, what was one of the experimental films, which was the Lily in Limbo experimental film, which I don't know where I read that, where somewhere online though you talk about it being the first film that you made together with Sylvie.
Yeah.
And um, so having known the both of you for, I don't know what it's been now, maybe 15 years or more. And I know we haven't been in much contact recently, but it was sweet to see that. Like, I guess sort of the beginnings. Maybe you knew each other before that, but this was a significant turning point, I suppose, in your relationship. It seemed like a significant turning point for her, working with very personal material, as I gathered in the making of the film. But it just seemed, and from what I could sense from it, probably you showing up for her and the collaborating in a way that was helping her. The making of the artwork was part of her processing, which is always the best possible situation, processing what was real and coming up for her in her living and difficult. Um, yeah, I don't know that I have a particular question about that, other than, am I was that a turning point? Were you together before that? Is that part of what brought you together as a couple, or?
um what brought us together as a couple happened in the summer of 95, about 6 months before we started Lily in Limbo.
Hmm.
And what brought us together was the promise of reinventing the romantic.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Neither one of us wanted to like get into a relationship where um, it's just going to end into typical boy girl, stuff, because we were both serious artists and committed, and we realized that a big part of any kind of future between us was going to have to be one of creative and artistic collaboration as a basis and a foundation for the love that we felt for each other. Meaning, we were not interested in becoming a domestic couple just by itself. In fact, Sylvia and I, previous to getting together as a couple, for 6 years, we knew each other through artistic collaboration, her music and my video and theater projects that were happening in those 6 years.
Mm.
What happened between us, we come from extremely different backgrounds. We're extremely different personalities. And so our coming together was nothing less than a supernova collision of contraries, working to find connections. Sometimes yes, sometimes no, but there's a tremendous energy coming together from really different extremes. She's, born and raised in the deep South. I come from the deep North, or the high North, whatever, and really different upbringings. Two things that are really alike is that we're both introverts, and we both are possessed, gifted and cursed by talent and artistic passion. And so part of the effect of us coming together, in a sense, derailed her from the life and the sense of identity that she knew before we came together. That it really, there was a big impact. I was impacted too, but in a different way. She was more psychologically impacted, and in many ways. For me, my impact from her was more, I would say, artistic, at least in the beginning. And so she was really flailing, like, who am I? Where am I going? I don't know what's going on anymore. What have you done to me? You've ruined my life. These kinds of things. And I said, wow, you are in a really interesting place right now. And this looks like a kind of limbo. You look like you're between personalities almost. And let's make a movie. Let's do something with this. Are you up for it? And up until that point, she had not been in front of a camera. She hadn't done any acting. She wasn't really excited by it. She says, "No, how can I do that? I don't know what I'm doing there." And I just told her, you don't have to know. The camera loves you, and it really did, because I did some tests, and there's just something about her presence. She didn't have to say a word, but somehow the camera was translating her presence almost like a silent movie star. That there was an inner quality, a kind of effervescence that was being caught on camera that I didn't see just with my naked eye. And I immediately grabbed that and says, okay, we're going to run with this. We're going to make a movie that's sort of like a silent movie, with some narrative, that we're going to be putting in, and music about this woman who is caught between worlds. And it's kind of starting to get into it, and it's not putting out any call to become saved from her predicament. That became really interesting to me, that she didn't want to be saved. She was finding a way to navigate this place between worlds, and this was part of, I think, that was supported her in her daytime life of really being torn between who she was and who she was becoming. So the movie gave her a context, a frame, a structure, a contained place to start experimenting and playing out certain ways of thinking, navigating, viewing things. So by the time we finished, and she was really in on everything. We were editing it together, and she was adding music. So this is like a really pure collaboration between us. about a half-hour film, and it's still one of my top three things that I've ever made or I've been part of making. Because it's just sheer poetry in that film, um, and there's nothing I could ever do to replicate or to
Hmm.
try to repeat that. It was a one of a kind thing.
I had that feeling about it, and I hear, some themes that we've been talking about, which is like for example, going back to the Rilke, the difference between actually giving birth versus giving birth to artistic creations. And it did seem that she was struggling with like, am I going to have this more conventional life and have kids, or am I going to be with this person who we're going to be artists and we're not going to have kids? And, obviously that's a huge limbo, transformation or change choice to make. Um, but it also, one of the reasons, because you're working with something so personal, she is, and you're making art of it, it's so authentic. Like I really feel she's so connected to what she's experiencing because she's experiencing it, and that's very clear. And I do agree, like her presence and her quality on camera, there's always a sense of there's something mysterious, but always lots going on internally, um, and not a lot necessarily needing to be going on externally, which is for so many actors on film, it's so hard to trust that, and not do too much externally, to trust that the internal churning is sufficient, but also required. You got to have something churning inside, otherwise it's it's going to be obvious that there's nothing churning inside. Um, but it does actually kind of move to something else that I've witnessed to some degree in the two films that we did together, but also heard you talk about in our conversations, which is this way of wanting to create, but also cast in a way where you're seeing what's alive in the people that you're potentially working with. And most of the people you cast, there are repeat people. We see a lot in your films of actors we've seen in your films before, which is not uncommon in the world of directors to work with the same artists again. But I also happen to know that a lot of them were also people you did paratheater with, or people you did other projects with, people sometimes who were friends. Um, a sense of community there. And when you make your films, people who are doing helping out with the food or the boom mic are people that sometimes were in your paratheater, your most recent paratheater group, or just people that that are friends. So it's a very like communal, what I get from it is a very communal thing. And so a lot of times when you're picking people to work on your films, you're very aware of what the dynamics of their lives maybe are and what's going on with them. Um, Now I've thought for a long time, I sort of joke with people that there's this thing in the 12-step world, which is like, God is my employer, meaning, I think I've heard you say that let the situation be the boss, like I'm going to trust that there's a larger thing at work here. I sort of co-opt that and say that God is my casting director, or the universe is my casting director, that truly I end up, if I trust it, in exactly the place getting cast in these parts where there's something for me there. There's something that's needing to be worked out or explored or uncovered. But it seems like you do that. It seems like I don't know if you can speak to that a little bit about how you're, and I assume that changes the way you write too. And sorry, this is a long question, but I also noticed that, because you don't, let's say, do the conventional storyboarding, sometimes you script ahead of time, sometimes you don't. A lot of it seems like the way you do things is sort of finding them as you go, um, following the thread and not necessarily having to have it all figured out ahead of time. And the casting process and the writing process and the way you work with actors is connected to that.
Yeah.
Am I on the right track here, or could you say something about this?
Yeah, there's several levels here.
Yeah.
at the base level is how I know a creative state. And that is, I experience the state of uncertainty as synonymous with the creative state. That means I'm enter a creative state when I don't know what's going to happen next. And so this is how it begins, with that kind of receptivity. You know, I've been working with groups of actors, you know, since probably the age of 21 when I started, you know, my experimental theater processes. And over the years, I mean, you know, if you're doing anything for more than 20 or 30 years, you're going to get good at something just because there's a lot of experience and exposure. Hopefully
Yeah,
you
sure.
get good at something. And what I've gotten really good at is judgment of character.
Mm.
And being able to perceive where an individual is in their life as opposed to where they want to be or where they think they should be, or if they're struggling with some kind of ego ideal and they've lost touch with the actual place where they're in. So I've gotten better at just kind of tuning into the current dynamic of an individual where they are more or less. And I tend to cast individuals for parts, and sometimes I will write a part for an individual.
Mm-hmm.
Oftentimes, I'm highly collaborative. If I can go there, I love writing characters for a particular person. But in tuning into, you know, a particular person, like for example, you know, even if I don't know them, I often don't audition actors. I meet them for lunch or for coffee, you know, and just talk about life, you know, ask them about their family, ask them about, you know, what do they love, and, you know, their fears, or, you know, who knows what's going to come up when you just meet with strangers. And I just pay attention and listen, and I can start honing into some part of them that is really consistent. You know, they may be changing this way and that, or trying to, you know, moving around, trying to hide or whatever. But they're typically, if you stick with someone for even 20 or 30 minutes and really pay attention, you can start honing into what I would call their chief feature, or something essential about them that is somehow consistent. So I kind of start tuning into that. And I tend to gravitate towards casting actors who are in a crisis in their life. Because what that does right away, they're already experience a more or less heightened sense of uncertainty. And this is kind of a big deal to me in working with actors. If they come on set too composed, too much in their comfort zones, that just arouses the mischief maker in me. You know, I want to throw them off balance some way.
Right.
I want to throw them a curveball. I want to get out of your comfort zone. You know, the camera is going to take a photograph of a dead actor if we do this. So I'm very keen on setting up a safe and relaxed enough environment in the setting so the actor can feel safe enough to enter a heightened state of uncertainty, because that is the only direction that to me is worth capturing on film, where when they're saying their lines doesn't come off as read, it comes literally off like if they haven't said it before. And it comes off as if they say it and they don't know what the fuck is going to happen next, and they're in this awareness, and then another line comes to them out of that place of uncertainty, and all of a sudden there's something exciting happening. And so I gravitate towards uncertainty, towards crises as a creative state, but also with, you know, the caveat of safety, relaxed environment. I never yell at my actors. I don't get into this kind of, you know, diva director temper tantrum or anything like that.
Mhm.
Um, Pretty low key. Like I have a low key, attitude on set. And so far, all the actors I've worked with has kind of appreciated that. Some actors, need a little hand holding, so I'll hold their hand for a little bit, and other actors actually like it when I back off and they just spin out on their own, whatever, and then I give them, feedback or not, whatever. So every actor is, I approach case by case. There's like no one way, um, except that one thing. If they come in too together, too composed, too much in their comfort zone, then I have to brainstorm and try to figure out, okay, where do we go from here? Because, we're starting from a dead zone.
Hmm. It's funny because I think a lot of people would, if somebody's in, well, maybe there's some nuance to it or there's a spectrum, but I think a lot of people would think, well, if this person is in crisis, are they going to show up on time? Are they going to, be reliable? But and I realize that crisis doesn't have to mean full on meltdown. It just has to mean there's something up in their lives that's connected to the thing that they're working with in the film that's alive, and percolating. Something has to be going on there. But
Well,
yeah,
like
go.
you were mentioning before about this thing about um, working through something that is difficult in your daily life through a
Mm-hmm.
role that you're playing.
Mm-hmm.
And anybody that has a passion for acting, anybody that loves, has a joy in what they're doing, knows what that is. That they're going to commit to a role because they have the opportunity, um, to work through something.
Mm-hmm.
So crises for me doesn't mean that they're going to flake on me. They're only going to flake on me if they haven't found the joy in acting, if it's a chore, or if they're just not into it. But uh, I the best actors I've worked with are basically like big kids. They're children. You know, the child within them is intact.
Mm-hmm.
It hasn't become so buried and uh, decapitated. I hate to use that word, but uh, you know, so I'm very sensitive to the child within individuals, and sometimes it's just a matter of talking kid to kid.
Mm-hmm.
My kid to your kid. We're going to play today, and so that greases the wheels of crisis. So crisis is manageable. It's workable. We're going to play today. The spirit of play is, to me, one of the highest forms of creativity. It's not, furrowed brow seriousness of trying to, make some big deal about something that's already a big deal,
Right. Yeah.
right? Like,
Yeah.
if you're playing tragedy, you don't want to put tragedy on tragedy. Tragedy is tragic enough, so you
Yeah.
just play it straight,
Try to
and
play
it's,
it. Yeah.
yeah, and it works.
Uh, I want to. Yeah, I think we've been going for quite a while, so I want to. Maybe we can find um, some closure here for now. One of the thoughts. So my kind of final thought for the day, and see what you think about this or what you have to say about it. Was I know that some of your pieces have been very improvised. Some of them have been scripted. Um, some people you've worked improvisationally with, let's say, for example, in Vanishing Field, I know you worked more improvisationally with the Roshi for um, because of his capacity, perhaps for that. Um, and I know that, like for example, in the films I worked with you, I saw you into Dreams of Falling Upwards. As I recall, there was a sense of like when we were shooting, it wasn't like a shot list. It was, you know, if I recall correctly, we did have a script, but we were shooting and you were finding a lot of stuff. In that case, you were also your own cinematographer. So, and I think if I remember correctly, in Invisible Forest, there was a very strong sense that you were like shooting, shooting, shooting. I will figure out what the story is in the editing room. So I'm wondering if you could say a little bit about your how your process has evolved, and then maybe it's just different every time, but like how your process has evolved in terms of like uh, where, what the process is of discovering a film or forming a film, how much of that you do ahead of time versus how much you improvise versus how much you discover along the way.
Right. It is different with each film. Um, the first step is, grasping the spirit of a particular film, like its character, um, and getting a sense of whether it's going to be more effectively conveyed through a linear script process where I write the screenplay out and the actors memorize the lines, um, or we go through another process of improvisation where maybe we'll have typically what I've been doing over the last 3 features. Um, Instead of rehearsals with the actors, I have what's called subtext meetings.
Mm-hmm.
And what we do is we just basically gather in a room and we go through the script, but we don't read the lines in rehearsal. We just sit down scene by scene, and I ask the actors, what's actually happening here beneath what the characters are actually saying. Because as in real life, oftentimes people will be talking to each other, but there's a whole lot going on besides what they're telling each other. So the subtext meeting is digging up this, what's actually happening in the moment, what's going on here. And when the actors and myself, we finally get on the same page, we have to start seeing, oh yeah, this is actually what's happening here. And the characters aren't revealing it. They're not revealing it by what they're saying, but this is what's happening here. Then we move on to the next scene and I take the notes. This is what's happening.
Mm-hmm.
This is what's happening. And so when we get around to shooting, I'm shooting the subtext.
Mm-hmm.
I'm finding the angles to show what's actually more happening here. And then we hear the words coming out, but by that time, the actors are speaking the words through the subtext. So they start with the subtext, and I give them a cue at every time. It says, okay, let's find the subtext. What's really happening here in the room? Forget about what you're saying. Drop down into the actuality of what's going on. And then they take that moment, they take that time, and then the words just come out with another resonance of truth to them that sometimes is in conflict with what's actually going on, which can be actually the greater truth. So with Invisible Force, for example, which is the whole thing was improvised with the exception of borrowing text from Antonin Artaud and William Shakespeare. They're the only ones that's credited with the writing
Right.
there. Everything is
Yeah.
improvised. Everything else is improvised. And, The Vanishing Field, I was working with non-actors. I was working with monks, Zen monks in a Zen monastery. And they were kind enough to agree with the story idea that I had to play themselves, basically, and just wait for cues where I would say, okay, in this scene, this is where we have to go. This is the direction we have to go in. Go. I turn the camera on and they would go.
Find their way
Uh,
there. Yeah.
yeah, and sometimes they got it the first time, and sometimes it took 3 or 4 times, but they always got it in the end. Except for the Roshi, he always got it first take every take.
Yeah.
You know, and he didn't need any cues or anything. He just, he sat himself down and he goes, "Okay, Antero, why am I here?" And I said, "That's a really good question, Roshi." So this is what we're doing. This guy is talking to you about meditating in order to get out of his body, and you have something to say about that. Go. And that's it. And he
Yeah.
just completely dialed into it. So I love working with non-actors because, of course, they don't carry any of the baggage of seasoned actors. And I love working with seasoned actors because, they have all these tools in their toolboxes and, just a lot of resilience and stamina of being able to just, go through all kinds of stuff and keep bouncing back. And,
Mm.
their commitment, is really amazing to watch.
Well,
Yeah.
I think one of the things that strikes me about, as it were, this towards a poor cinema or this underground cinema that you do, I think the freedom with which you were able to shoot on the day and explore. I think, I think of like, I don't, because I've not worked with a lot of these people, but I know Mike Nichols, for example, worked a lot. I think it was him who did a lot of improvising to discover the text, the what might be the text with his actors. So it was more improvisatory. And there are some other directors out there who are more improvisatory in their approach. But like, I when I was with you on set, you were, because you have so much experience just kind of walking around with a camera, making your video poems, your experimental works, and um, you were just sort of like finding things. You didn't have a preset shot list that we had to get to. And because the budget is not, we did have like timelines that we had to hit because there were certain locations maybe we had for a certain amount of time. But I also had the experience that you gave a lot of breathing room to shooting schedules, for example, so that there was room to, for you as a filmmaker to play and to have the space to play, experiment, and just whatever, I'll shoot that, I'll shoot this, and find things instead of knowing ahead of time what you were going to get.
Well,
Yeah.
as you recall, just in the two films you were in, um, we never had shooting days that were more than 6 or 7 hours at a time.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's because a complete betrayal of the Hollywood film industry when you
Right.
got,
Yeah.
18-hour days, of, full on exhaustion. Um, and oftentimes, my shoot days are like, 4 or 5 hours at a time. Um, I don't make shot lists. I don't storyboard. And in fact, no, I did make my first shot list on a short film I've recently finished, a 30-minute film called The Celebrants.
Yeah.
And it was just for the hell of it. I said, I'm going to break my own rules here. I need to kind of get
There you
over
go.
myself. And
Yeah.
and so I made a shot list of 20 shots, very specific actions in each shot. And each shot was, anywhere from a minute to 3 minutes. And I created a piece of work that I had never created anything like this before, and I was really kind of proud of it. But it was a complete betrayal of my own,
Yeah.
kind of style of winging it basically, and finding everything on site. And that's typically been my style. Even when I have a script without a shot list, I have to be in the setting, whatever it is, by
Yeah.
myself, for a good 20 or 30 minutes just to explore the angles, the given properties of the set, the shadows, the lights, the shape of the set, how much space there is, just taking it all in. And to me, it's all about angles and light. It's pretty
Yeah.
much the interaction of that, whether it's natural light or artificial or a combination of, and what is the audio situation there, how's the sound, the ambience and acoustics and all that. And then when I have that, I bring in the actors and I kind of check them out. They're part of the situation, the state they're in,
Mm-hmm.
pretty much is going to determine how I'm going to begin, where I'm going to place them. Even, it can even change the direction of the movie if they're in a particular state that is very, let's say, authentic to that moment, but is unexpected. I didn't expect him to come in, in a state of depression or something.
What a relief, because I just have to say, for my own experience, I mean, I had sort of a very difficult or traumatic time in grad school at one point, because one particular artist that was training me was like adamant, like, I don't care what's going on with you, you are a professional, you check it at the door. And I was like, I can't do that. I can't work that way. She and
Right.
I just, we never got along. But, it's such, and I've been in other situations where directors are so, intent on whatever their vision is or whatever their agenda is, that they can't see me or others in the room as artists, let alone what's a direct perception of what's going on with us in the moment, and willingness to make use of that rather than fight it, um, I think it's such a blessing to work with, that quality of you as a director. um, if you're up for one more question, it does remind me of Lars von Trier. I love that you did a shot list, his 5 obstructions, I think it was, where he and his he was just being mischievous, as you say, fucking with his friend and giving him things he had to do, obstacles, 5 obstacles. I forget exactly what it was called, uh, but thinking about Lars von Trier, I know you've liked his work, and I love the list of visionary filmmakers that you put together. It's one of my favorite lists of like films to watch, and many of them I had already seen, but it also exposed me going through that list and watching films that you have listed there. So obviously you've been, profoundly impacted by a lot of these. I'm curious which, in your self-taught filmmaking process, and maybe this is too long of a question to finish on, but like, have there been any filmmakers that were like the heavy influences for you, inspirations? um I guess I have another question in here related to your, maybe how you've learned the craft over time just through experience. But I don't know. I'm searching for the question here.
No,
It's in there
I
somewhere.
follow. I
Yeah.
follow. Um, Andrei Tarkovsky is probably the greatest influence to my cinematic tastes and um, aspirations. Uh, I consider him a true master of cinema. And every time I watch one of his films, I want to quit filmmaking because where he's gone. So, it's the kind of thing. I mean, I'm deeply moved and inspired by his craft, his talent, the finesse, the insight, everything that he puts together in almost every single film he's made. I call them each one of masterpieces. Ingmar Bergman considers Tarkovsky his teacher, his guru, that kind of. So you look at Bergman, who's also a favorite of mine. So I say, I experience a kind of a gorgeous oppression in watching these great filmmakers, and knowing that I can never achieve what they have been able to achieve, and yet it still fires me up to try or to aspire or to move towards that. And so that's where that goes. Lars von Trier too, especially his earlier work, Breaking the Waves and the element of crime, just extraordinary. Somehow they both completely blew me away. And he explained in his approach to Breaking the Waves, his direction to the camera people, because basically he had 3 or 4 people on camera walking around. And these camera operators asked him, what should we shoot? What kind of angle? What do you want? The only thing he said is just shoot the action. Okay, that's a very interesting direction, because at that time, the camera people have to decide what the action is.
Yeah.
And so what happened, in doing that, it produced a highly kinetic filmmaking style that I had never seen anything quite like that. And then I saw it again in a film called Amores Perros, Inarritu, the Mexican visionary filmmaker. And that also blew me away, Amores Perros. Similar kind of highly kinetic filmmaking. where it engaged me viscerally, not just visually or intellectually or emotionally, but my body was just constantly responding to what I was picking up on screen.
Mm-hmm.
And I wanted to be part of that. I wanted to somehow, contribute to that, and I wanted to experience some of that in my movies.
Hmm.
Um, so
Well,
yeah, those are the main. There are others too. Like sometimes David Lynch, although I've kind of outgrown my interest in his films, over the last 10 years or so. But
hmm.
some of his earlier work, like Blue Velvet and Lost Highway, was just hauntingly beautiful and extraordinarily moving and really terrifying in really genuine kinds of ways.
Hmm.
That I knew that he was working with the, his transcendental meditation practice of deep access to the subconscious.
Hmm.
So he was, in line with the surrealists of the 1920s and 30s, who discovered that the content material of art was really originating in the subconscious, not the conscious ego.
Hmm. Hmm.
And this is part of with Salvador Dali, the melting watches, or Jean Cocteau, in his visionary films, and a lot of other artists in the surrealist movement tapped into that
Well,
interaction. Yeah.
I think this speaks to the juicy connection between the paratheatrical work that you do and how it informs your creative process as a filmmaker, which is perhaps for another time. But in conclusion, I'd like to say, like, all those, so many of those filmmakers that you listed, you know, in your own way, we each have like a humble corner of the universe. But I think you certainly, I can say without a doubt that your work has inspired a lot of artists and continues to, both your collaborators and people who have just uh, been able to experience the work that you've done. Certainly that's true for me. So it's really, you know, I appreciate our friendship and our collaboration over the years and the mentorship with which you've shared some of your experience and wisdom with me. And, it's just great. I'm just pleased to be able to have another chance to have an extended conversation like this with you about I don't know what the word I'm looking for, your,
Process.
yes, your process and also your body of work
Yeah.
at this stage in your journey. So
I
yeah,
appreciate your words a lot. Very kind and generous. Just one little note I just want to
sure.
end on here, and that is, I would be really happy to start another conversation like this, focusing on how the paratheta work that I've been developing for the last 40 years, especially over the last 20 years, has informed many of the characters, themes, and
Mm-hmm.
plot lines of the films I've made, that have erupted from that highly kinetic group ritual dynamic, the experiments that I've been undergoing with a number of different groups of individuals from all walks of life. Because it really is as a major influence. I don't really talk about it that much, except my upcoming book called Sacred Rites,
Mm-hmm.
Journal Entries of a Gnostic Heretic. It'll be
Love that
released
title. Yeah.
next month on the Original Falcon Press. It'll be also on Amazon. And that is a book uh, comprised of my ritual journal entries over an 11-year stretch, when I was making films inspired by the results of some of this work. And I also included about a dozen other ritual journal entries from individuals who joined me in this process. So it's basically my ritual journal entries and individuals I trained in this process, to share some of the deeper subjective and internal experiences and imagery and stories that uh, that have erupted during that work process. So there's a whole lot to share about then, and there's no way we can go into it now.
Well, I mean, we barely skimmed the surface of the body of work that you've put together. I mean, I feel it's been a great talk, and I'm fully up for a part two at some point, especially to talk about the connection between more about paratheater and the connection between paratheater and whatever artistic medium, in this case, filmmaking. So, yeah, I'd love to. And, for now, I guess we'll call it a day, and I'm sure we'll talk again soon. Let me just
Okay.
let me just stop this.